Good morning, everyone. I'm John Rogers, the chairman of the Atlantic Council, and it's truly a pleasure to be hosting this special event today, broadcast live on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. This session is just the latest in the Council's front page series, our live ideas platform spotlighting extraordinary leaders who are championing constructive solutions to the global challenges we collectively face. By all measures, the issues we are grappling with are formidable. Navigating an uneven global economy, stamping out COVID-19, responding to climate concerns, negotiating geopolitical dynamics and rising tensions, and reckoning with social unrest. Against that backdrop, very few people find themselves working at the nexus of all of these issues, with each absolutely essential to promoting and sustaining a peaceful and well-functioning world order. But that's precisely the job description of our guest today. And fortunately for all of us, there is perhaps no person more experienced, more insightful, more respected, and more capable in every way than Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the 7th Director-General of the World Trade Organization. A trailblazer in every sense of the word, Dr. Ngozi is the first woman and the first African to lead the WTO. She is a natural leader, a deep and genuine person, and someone I'm very proud to say that I've gotten great advice from over the years, particularly with our 10,000 Women program. The raison d'etre of the WTO, trade, is also the core of the Atlantic Council's mission. In fact, it was the US and the European trading relationship that was integral to the founding of the Council. And of course, issues of commerce and trade were also front and center at the Bretton Woods negotiations 75 years ago. Emerging from the ashes of the war, the 44 states and governments represented worked to build a system that would facilitate rather than undermine or block global trade. But most will agree that the system, 3/4 of a century later, is in need of reforms to keep pace with globalization, technology, and other advancements since. To this end, the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomic Center is doing its part to help drive inclusive and meaningful discussions to forge a new consensus on how trade can play a positive role in our economic and political systems, and the best way to approach the broader international financial system. As such, it's safe to say that Dr. Ngozi has been chosen to lead the WTO at one of the most transformative and challenging moments in its history. After navigating tariff disputes and trade wars in 2018 and 2019, the WTO is now simultaneously tackling the economic and health impact of the pandemic while managing the restart of the global trade engine. As vaccination efforts continue, countries are looking to see how the WTO will address these critical issues, not the least of which is vaccine nationalism and massive supply chain bottlenecks. With Dr. Ngozi at the helm, however, the WTO and the world has put itself in the strongest position to address and overcome these critical set of challenges. And over a 25-year career at the World Bank as a development economist, rising to the #2 position, she had oversight for the organization's $81 billion operational portfolio in Africa, South Asia, Europe, and Central Asia. And she spearheaded initiatives to assist low-income countries during the 2008-2009 food crisis, and later during the global financial crisis. Having also served as Nigeria's finance minister during 2 separate terms, Dr. Ngozi was the first woman to hold that position and distinguish herself by executing major reforms that improved Nigeria's economy before going on to become the chair of the board of the Gavi Fund, the Vaccine Alliance dedicated to improving access to vaccines for children living in the world's poorest countries. And with that, it's a great honor to have her here with us today to share her insights and her vision for the road ahead as the World Trade Organization confronts perhaps one of the greatest inflection points in our global economic systems history. Moderating our discussion today with Dr. Ngozi is Fred Kemp, the president of the Atlantic Council, to whom I'm now going to yield the floor. And Fred, I'm turning it over to you.
John, thank you so much for those remarks, and thank you for your leadership not only as the chairman of the Atlantic Council, but also as the person whose vision has resulted in the Geoeconomic Center that is playing such a significant role in the conversation we'll have today on the future of trade, future of WTO, but so much about the global economy. Dr. Ngozi, it's an honor for me to moderate the first part of this conversation. This is part of a series of events hosted by our Geoeconomic Center this summer, including 2 weeks ago when White House National Economic Council Director Brian Dees came to speak about U.S. national industrial policy, and so something we'll also discuss today. When we launched the Geoeconomic Center last December in a conversation with Christine Lagarde, we defined the future of capitalism as one of our core pillars. Since then, we've launched the Inclusive Growth Project, and I know how much that issue motivates you as well, Dr. Ngozi. So let's dive into the conversation. I welcome all our viewers, and we have viewers who are in the morning hours, the afternoon hours, the evening hours, all across the world. I invite you all to engage through the hashtag AC front page. And I'm sure we're all looking forward to this discussion. So for my first question, Dr. Ngozi, perhaps you could take us back to Venice, where you've just been at the G20 finance ministers meeting, the first meeting in person since they've had since February of 2020. Give us a feeling of what was the mood in the room? What were the issues that were there? Is there a feeling that we've turned the corner, the COVID corner, or are there concerns about new fault lines, new issues, new disruptions that could still result from this period of time?
Well, thank you so much, Fred. And let me also thank John for that generous introduction and join you in commending his visionary leadership. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. And indeed, it was exciting to be in Venice with the G20 finance ministers. I had gone there with Larry Summers and Tharman Shanmugaratnam, the senior minister of Singapore, because we were co-chairs of a high-level panel to look at, that was commissioned by the G20 finance ministers to look at financing the next pandemic. So we participated in a session that indeed looked at these issues. Later on, I think they had other discussions on the new corporate tax proposal that has just been agreed through the OECD. I would say that I think, first of all, people gathering together for the first time physically, many of the ministers were there physically, but some joined in a virtual fashion. I think that ability to be together one more time was something that I thought everyone was excited about, pleased that perhaps we can resume some form, or we are marching towards a little bit of normalcy. But I would not say that the mood was we're through it, we're ready to go. I think there was very much a recognition that we are still, the recovery is on, is surging on in some parts of the world, particularly in North America, in Europe, and also most parts of Asia. But that it's fragile. And it's fragile because we recognize that there's a K-shaped recovery going on. I think there was a recognition of that. There's some continents doing well, others not so well. Africa, Latin America, Middle East not recovering at the same pace. And there's one thing behind that all, the issue of vaccine inequity. That was very much behind that. And the realization, the IMF says it clearly, economic policies, vaccine policy. I say trade policies, vaccine policy. The recognition that until we solve the inequity in access we see now in the world, we're not really going to have a sustainable recovery because nobody is really safe. And even if you vaccinate everyone in your country, these new variants and the mutations can still come back to haunt you. So there was certainly an appreciation for that. And therefore, the report that we put forward proposing a funding mechanism of $15 billion a year, of which $10 billion would be to support preparedness and prevention received a tremendous amount of support. So that is the atmosphere we met, the realization things are not yet where they should be, the fact that we still have work to do, but we have the elements of a recovery, and it's within our grasp to try to do what is necessary to put us on a sustainable and inclusive recovery.
So thank you, Dr. Ngozi, for that fascinating first answer. Since you touched right up front on the issue of vaccines, let me go to that. The COVAX distributed less than half the doses it initially allocated for dispersion from February to May. There is a health and economic cost of these delays that you talked about. What can the WTO do specifically for this process? And do you think, for example, intellectual property agreements need to be waived? What can people do in a concrete fashion to accelerate with this? As you said, this is going to be a key to the fragile economic recovery.
Well, I thank you, Fred. I think just continuing on the theme of vaccine policies, economic policy, we proposed, first I want to put on the table this proposal based on a study by the IMF for $50 billion that could vaccinate the world, 40% of the world's population this year, up to 60% next year. If we did that, the IMF estimates we would enter this sustainable recovery path, we would solve most of the inequity problem, and this could create another $9 trillion in GDP for the world by 2025. And I'm putting that just for people to imagine how beneficial the economic and human benefits to the world of making vaccines available to everyone. So what can be done by the WTO specifically, you ask? We're facing a big supply scarcity. That's what the problem is. We usually manufacture 5 billion doses of vaccines worldwide. Now we are facing a situation in which we need to manufacture 10 billion and even 15 billion if we have to do booster shots, as some of the manufacturers are proposing. This is a big stretch for the world, and the supply scarcity is driving behavior. This is why many countries have, bid for vaccines, bid them away. So many of them supported COVAX, but I have to say, given the politics of it, that they also bid away vaccines from COVAX. And that's why COVAX has been struggling to deliver what it should. And so for the WTO, what the question is, how can it help solve this problem? And the problem of scarcity, I think the WTO can work in 3 ways. The first is on the issue of supply chains, monitoring export restrictions and prohibitions. As you know, the supply chains for these vaccines are very complex. Pfizer's supply chain is 280 components made at 86 sites in 19 countries. Johnson & Johnson is 180 components made at 67 sites in 12 countries. AstraZeneca, 15 countries. When you have those kinds of complicated supply chains, it means that any restriction or prohibition that stops inputs from flowing or outputs from going out, is a real block on the production of vaccines. So this is within the ambit of what the WTO does. It's our members who have these export restrictions and prohibitions. We have a strong monitoring function. This is one place we can really help the world by trying to make sure our members do everything to facilitate trade in these products and removes all the restrictions. I just want to say we started with 109 restrictions at the beginning of the pandemic. We're down to 53, very good, but still not good enough for me. I always describe myself as Oliver Twist, wanting some more. So I want members to lower that. So that's one thing we can clearly do. Linked to that is work with manufacturers on even more detailed aspects of supply chain monitoring. We found that we just held a supply chain symposium last week, that manufacturers need help in trying to monitor the nitty-gritty of their bottlenecks with raw materials, with other goods, and helping them to make sure that these also keep flowing, quite apart from the export restrictions. Making sure that we unlock those bottlenecks is also important. So that's another aspect of what the WTO can do. I think a third, and of course, working with these the manufacturers in this way, we also encourage them to increase investment in capacity, to scale up production as we work with them by investing more in developing countries and emerging markets in particular. A third aspect has to do with the transfer of technology and know-how and the intellectual property issues you just raised, which is being debated or negotiated here at the WTO. Without the transfer of technology and know-how, you also cannot manufacture or increase output. Now, with respect to IP, I hasten to tell people that since I'm the DG of the WTO and I have members on both sides of the issue, we have proponents of IP, we have those who don't believe this is so important for production. I have to stay in the middle. My job is to bring our members together, and I'm happy to say they are now negotiating a text on the IP issue, and I hope they will come to a conclusion that is pragmatic, allowing developing countries to have access, but also protects research and development and innovation. So to conclude, the WTO can be active in these three areas, and in fact, you need all three to work together to scale up vaccines.
Thank you so much for that wonderful answer, Dr. Ngozi. We all can now hear why you have a reputation as a woman of action, but you also have a reputation as a history maker. You're the first, as John Rogers said, you're the first woman, first African to lead the WTO. You have said that you, quote, absolutely do feel an additional burden and that you have to produce results. But laying aside some of these specifics, there's a more fundamental question, and that is the restoration of trust and confidence in the WTO. Many actually have questioned its very role in existence in a world where there are many more regional trade agreements. Could you address this and what you think is the most important thing you have to do to take on this trust and confidence issue?
Thank you, Fred. Well, first of all, let me say that people say I made history, but it's the members of the WTO who really made history by selecting me or electing me. There have been 9 men in these 75 years. And so being a woman, yes, it's not just about being a woman, it's about being competent and knowing your job. So hopefully they selected the person who can help unblock the issues facing the WTO. And the WTO is facing issues and challenges at this time. There's a lot it can do. I just illustrated to you what the WTO can do for trade, what world trade can mean, but there's still a lot that it needs to do. And you've talked of trust. One of the things I noticed as a candidate is that there's a trust deficit, let's put it that way, between members, between developed countries and developing countries, between China, US, EU, China, EU, US, you name it, in any configuration. And so this is something that we really need to build up. So how do I see it? What's the vision? One of the things that I really love about the WTO that attracted me here is its purpose, which is very clearly spelled out in the Marrakesh Agreement, setting it up, which is to say that the WTO is supposed to help enhance living standards for people, create employment, and support sustainable development. This is all about people. And what is frustrating to me is that that seems to have been forgotten. The WTO is criticized in so many ways. People don't realize or recognize what it was created for. So one of the main objectives I have, a vision of the WTO being returned to its primary purpose of being about people. And if it's about people, then I think that underpins the way you go about business. If this organization is supposed to enhance people's living standards and make things better for people, then you wouldn't take 20 years to negotiate an agreement. You wouldn't take 20 years to negotiate away harmful fisheries subsidies that are hurting the sustainability of our oceans and our fish stocks. It wouldn't take 20 years to negotiate an agricultural agreement that is supposed to enhance food security for people. And I could go on and on. So my vision is to restore that and to use coming to conclusion, agreeing on some things as a means of building trust. Building trust is not something you can talk about. It's something you have to demonstrate. You have to start very practically. Being a pragmatic person, I think if we can get some agreements like the fisheries subsidies done, for instance, get an agreement on trade and health, as members work in these multilateral ways together, I think that begins to build the trust that you can work together, you can deliver together. And let me tell you, on these issues, everyone is around the table right now. On issues of solutions to COVID-19 that WTO can assist with or trade can do, on issues of the fisheries subsidies, we have a multilateral process with everyone going on, and I hope this will contribute. Ultimately, the WTO has to update its rules and move with the times. We're in digital now. We need new rules to underpin digital trade and e-commerce. And so updating these rules, being more inclusive, these are some of the aspects of the vision and the dream that I have for the WTO.
What a wonderful answer, Dr. Ngozi. And I think that's something that's often missed, that trade is about people in the end and not just economies. Let me, since you mentioned the fisheries agreement, the cognoscenti on this call will know that this is a hot topic right now. And so I'm even inviting you to make a little news at the moment if you can. We've got an upcoming deadline later this week. As you said, negotiations have been going on for, I don't know whether it's 30 years or 20 years, but you can, and there have been almost daily meetings in 2020. This is really going to be a bellwether agreement. And can you give us some insight on why you think things could be different this time in reaching a fisheries agreement and what we might see later on this week?
Well, thank you. Like you just mentioned, and I said, it's been 20 years. And for the first time, why I think things might be different is our wonderful chair of the negotiations, Ambassador Santiago Wills of Colombia, has managed to put together a negotiating text that so far nobody has thrown out. In the past, it's not been possible to get one text that members could even agree met some of their concerns. So now for the first time, since the work in 2020, we have a text. And what we're trying to do is, for this meeting that I called in 2 days' time, bringing trade ministers together, is to say, look, we now have a possible text. It's not perfect. Members still have problems with it, but it contains an approach that could work for everyone. So we need you to give the political heft and support needed to move this forward, because I think we must finish these negotiations before the end of the year, which is when we have the trade ministerial. And we want this to be done and blessed at that time. So I wouldn't call it too much hope. I don't want to sound too hopeful or give false expectations. But I think that this meeting of the 15th should kick us along the path towards agreement because of the fact that we have a basis on which to move forward.
And thank you so much for that. Digital trade and e-commerce, estimated to be worth about 1.5 and 27 trillion a year, respectively, digital trade and e-commerce. Despite this, the WTO lacks a comprehensive agreement on either, or even a really clear approach. You've suggested this could be a priority for you. It can particularly help women-owned or micro and small, medium-sized enterprises in the global system. Could you elaborate on what specific reforms you're thinking about and what you would ask WTO members to consider in this space?
Well, let me say this, Fred. This pandemic has illustrated, the trend was there before that the world is going digital. But I think the pandemic just heightened and highlighted this trend. And what we've seen is that e-commerce has grown considerably. And small and medium-sized businesses, many more of them could have been shut down if not for the fact that they could trade through the internet. So this is something that is here to stay. I love it because of the fact that this is one way I see you can include women, you can include small and medium enterprises. In many parts of the world, the two go together. Women own over 50% of micro, medium, and small enterprises. And when they do have access to the internet, they can directly connect with their customers. And this is very helpful. I often use the example of women in Rwanda who were able to sell directly coffee to customers in China, and they made $4 more per ton than they would have made going through an intermediary. You saw the explosion of people making face masks, and many women doing this and selling on the internet. So, for me, digital is key. But in order to have a fair, transparent, and level playing field for digital trade and to solve many of the issues about cross-border data flows that underpin it, how to manage the taxation issue, e-signatures, all these things that could make life much easier, e-payments, you need some agreement. And so the WTO does not yet have an agreement underpinning this, but I'm happy to say that right now, when there's a plurilateral negotiations going on, it doesn't have everybody. That's why it's plurilateral. It's 83 members that have joined on the e-commerce, and they are pushing forward on this agreement. And we're very hopeful that within the next, maybe by MC13, not this ministerial, but the next one, would be able to come up with an agreement with a set of rules that can help us underpin digital trade. So that's the way we are going. One more thing on for women and business. Apart from e-commerce, the WTO and the International Trade Center, ITC, also do something that is often not recognized. And I saw an example of this when I visited my own country, Nigeria, on an official visit. On the ground, the WTO and the ITC are working with women to upgrade the quality of their products so that they can break into international markets, so that they can join regional and global value chains. So for instance, shea butter producers in my country, Nigeria, they couldn't sell to the US or Europe because of sanitary and phytosanitary issues and other technical barriers to trade. But by working with them to solve these problems and upgrade the quality of their product, they are now in these markets. And that's the kind of thing on the ground that the WTO can actually do. Apart from rules and policies, it can touch lives directly. And so this is another exciting way we can help.
That is so powerful, Dr. Ngozi. In a moment, I'm going to pass to the Deputy Director of the Geoeconomics Center to moderate second half here, Julia Friedlander. But before I do that, I'd like to ask you something a little bit more personal so that people get a feeling of you and your background. It's not the first time you've taken on a high-profile position with a lot of problems to sort through and very high expectations. We met first when you were finance minister in Nigeria. You left a long and decorated career at the World Bank to do that job. That was quite a risk for you. Could you talk about what led you to make that decision and the difficulties you and your family had to face in that time, because it was a quite courageous decision on your part?
Fred, you've just given me a chance to advertise my 2 books on that very subject. I wrote 2 books capturing the experience. The first one is called Reforming the Unreformable, that captures the experience of trying to reform Nigeria's economy. The first time I was finance minister from 2003 to 2006. And some of the reasons behind that. The second is called Fighting Corruption is Dangerous, the story behind the headlines. And that captures my term from 2011 to 15. Both are published by MIT Press. So I have to try and capture in 1 minute or less what I try to put in those books. First, why did I leave? You're right, I had a wonderful job at the World Bank. The first time I was the vice president and corporate secretary, when my President Obasanjo, asked me to come and serve. And I left that job, not because I had the vision I was going to be finance minister, but because it was a call to serve my country. And, I've been brought up in public service my whole life by my parents. So that was a chance to give back. And my president wanted in particular some expertise in getting our debts written off or, negotiated. We had $30 billion in debt to the Paris Club with a debt service of $2 billion a year, of which we could only pay $1 billion. And he just had this dream that we had to systematize our debt and negotiate this. And this is what I did. So we were able to do that and a lot of other reforms. The second time around, I focused on fighting corruption and trying to put Nigeria's financial management system on a modern path, So all these issues of trying to update and modernize things is not new. So we had a cash-based financial management system when I took over. And so we tried to work to put in technology, because when you do that, you lower the ability for things to go wrong, for corruption to creep in. And just by having an integrated financial management system, we're able to cut down on the phenomenon of ghost workers, where people used to put additional people on the payroll of the ministries. Ghost pensioners, ghost workers will graduate to ghost pensioners. And so we got rid, and that saved $1.1 billion for the government. So that is, now, we were fighting other types of corruption. We had an oil subsidy system in which we used to pay oil marketers who brought in refined oil we pay them the difference between the market price and the subsidized price that the government had mandated for selling oil to people. And so when I came the second time, this was a big problem. When I left government the first time in 2006, the subsidies were about $2 billion. When I came back, the first thing we noticed was that it had grown to 11 billion. And I said to myself, surely we couldn't have had so many people join the middle class and buy cars and be able to afford this. So what's going on? It was clear something was wrong. So I asked President Jonathan, the president, if we could audit the oil accounts, which he fully supported. When we audited $8.5 billion of accounts, we found $2.5 billion of fraudulent claims. And with his backing, we refused to pay that to the marketers. And that led to a series of problems, which I won't bore you with, threats to my life and my mother being kidnapped for 5 days, one of the worst periods of my life. It was a very tough period. But that being said, I think the privilege of serving my country as finance minister for 7 years, all told, and being able to work on some reforms is one of the best things I've ever done.
What a wonderfully rich answer. I'm sure we could probably do another hour just on this. But instead, I'll tell everybody, reforming the unreformable, fighting corruption is dangerous. Buy them, MIT Press, buy them on your local bookshop, Amazon, whatever. And thank you so much for your public service. I'm going to pass now. And by the way, I can't wait to hear what the WTO book will be written about, but we'll see that a little bit later on. At this point, it's my honor to pass to Julia Friedlander. She's the C. Boyden Gray Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of the Geoeconomic Center. She'll facilitate a series of questions from Atlantic Council senior fellows and staff. Please remember to use the hashtag if you want to engage with this conversation, hashtag AC Front Page. And Julia, over to you.
Thank you, Fred, so much. And Dr. Ngozi, once more on behalf of the Atlantic Council, it's really an honor to have you here today. As Fred mentioned, I'm going to bring in a few colleagues of mine to ask you a couple of questions, starting with Ambassador Ramayad, who is the director of our Africa Center here.
Thank you, Julia. Dear Dr. Ngozi, I would like to warmly welcome you at the Council. Happy to represent here the Atlantic Council's Africa Center. I would like to focus my question on the African Free Trade Area. As you know, it has been launched in January of this year. And as you know, it is the largest free trade area in the world. An increase of 7% and 450 billions are expected within 2035. A more resilient economy through regional integration on a continent where the level of trade between African countries is only 15%, 70% in Europe and Asia, and only 2% of the world trade. This initiative is a historic turning point. The challenges are important, are tough. Elimination of trade and non-trade barriers within a reasonable time, harmonization of intellectual property rights, compatibility with the current sub-regional free trade areas, each with different regulations, problems of transport, of connection, of communication, the prohibitive price of the internet, all this, because all this, many fear that the free trade area will benefit foreign exporting countries rather than African countries themselves. How can, Dr. Ngozi, how can the WTO and the richest country in the world support the African free trade area so it can be a success, particularly for African countries? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Rama, very much. I'm very proud of you. Thanks for what you're doing at the Atlantic Center. Well, the African Continental Free Trade Area, as you said, is one of the best things I think the continent has done, creating a market of 1.3 billion people. This, the formulation of this Continental Free Trade Area and its rules, I'm happy to say, just like most regional trade agreements, was based on WTO rules, most favored nation rules. So WTO has been a foundation for putting these rules together and hopefully will be a companion as we try to implement. First, through Aid for Trade and other mechanisms, we're very willing to work with the Secretariat to try and strengthen and support those who are going to make sure that the free trade area runs. We're ready to do partnerships in various areas. You mentioned digital. Digital is very important. And many of our countries face the digital divide. Like you said, they don't have even the basic infrastructure, access to the internet. I think access to the internet for our young people is much higher, about 44, 45%. But across the continent, I think is like just above 25% or so. So we have a lot of work that we can do together to bridge the digital divide. We also have a lot of work we can do together on issues of sanitary and phytosanitary matters to help, the program She Trades with the International Trade Center, which is an offshoot of the WTO. We can do a lot to help on the ground. Working together. But coming back, Ram, I think there are 2 or 3 big things we need to think about on the continent to make it really work. One is all those obstacles you mentioned with respect to movement. We've launched the area, but it is true that crossing borders for goods and services is still a problem. So, our leaders have to come together and agree to reduce those barriers so that trucks can move. You don't have to see 8-mile line of trucks at any border waiting to cross. We need to obviously work together on infrastructure if we are going to be serious about this free trade, continental free trade area. So all those, I would start with the bureaucratic barriers, which I think with what I call a stroke of the pen kind of approach, you can do away with a lot of them. Movement of people. The AU launched something which I'm very proud of, which is a one passport for Africans. Can you imagine, how, people can move freely if you have this one passport? I have a copy of the passport. I should have brought it to show off. And I hope that it will go to our business people and then everyone else so we can move. So the continent has really started on a good path. We just need to move faster. And particularly on digitalization, we need to move faster on those issues. Second, I think, look, to trade more among ourselves and with the outside world, we also need to invest more. We've been exporting raw materials. And if we don't do something to add value to the materials we produce on the continent, we will not be able to bolster trade the way that we want. So investing in manufacturing and value added is key. It's also key to keeping jobs within the continent. Every time we export raw materials to be processed somewhere, we're exporting jobs. So I think one of the key things we have to do is attract investment domestically. We have African private sector that has been investing in other countries, by the way. And if you look at some of the numbers, you might find that Africa to Africa investment is even higher. It has been higher for some years than FDI, than foreign direct investment. So we need to encourage our own domestic business people to invest in all the countries. You've got some of them already started. You've got Dangote, who is in 14 or 15 countries. You have UBA, Tony Elumelu in 8 or more countries, and on and on. We have several business people. These are Nigerian business. 2, in doing that, we must specialize. We can't all produce the same thing. Look at pharmaceuticals, and I've stopped there because I'm getting too excited. We import more than 90% of the pharmaceuticals we use, 99% of the vaccines. Why can't we dream of a pharmaceutical industry on the continent? This is a golden opportunity now, and I'm glad to say Senegal, Rwanda, South Africa, my country, Nigeria, we've all started seeing, but we must specialize. We don't all have to produce the same vaccines or the same things. So those kinds of actions, to cut a long story short, can make the African continental free trade area real. And the WTO is doing an investment facilitation agreement that can help this. We have a trade facilitation agreement that can assist with this. And so we are ready to work.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to turn next to one of our senior fellows, Dr. Nicole Golden.
Great. Thank you so much, Julia. It's really a pleasure to be with you, Dr. Ngozi. And I appreciated your comments about gender inequality. And we know that trade has such an important role to play in addressing the catastrophic economic impact of COVID-19 on women. And it's a priority for us here at the Council, as well as looking at some of the other areas of inequality, whether it's generational inequality or geographic inequality that has really been exacerbated both here in the US as well as in countries abroad. And along those lines, taking that a little bit of a step further, you've taken the reins at the WTO during an extraordinarily challenging time. Governments around the world are still in very different stages of dealing with a fractured, unequal recovery, as you talked about, that has led to massive supply chain bottlenecks and a growing perception that production lines need to be brought closer to home through nearshoring or ally shoring to help even the playing field. 2 weeks ago, Brian Deese, the director of the White House National Economic Council, came to the Atlantic Council to give a speech on the need for US industrial policy. And the US is not the only country thinking this way. As more countries establish industrial policies, do you see a risk of rising protectionism? Thank you.
Thank you. That's an interesting and challenging question. So it has issues of inclusion, and it has issues of new types of protectionism and nationalism. So on the side of inclusion, I've already said quite a bit, so I won't dwell on it. But I'm a person who is a strong believer that trade can help inclusion. Trade has lifted billions of people out of poverty, hundreds of millions, and benefited so many. But it hasn't, people have been left behind. And I think it's really linked to your protectionist tendencies. Within rich countries, you have people who have been left behind, and there are poor countries who have not benefited from trade. Now, it is not trade that is responsible for all of this. Technological changes are also very important. Whole sectors and industries like mining are changing because of technology, and often trade gets a bum rap for some of the things that are happening. But I really believe that you can use trade to be more inclusive by focusing on how you can help micro, medium, and small enterprises enter global and regional value chains, and women by this point that they are most of the owners of these enterprises. So I think we can do a lot for inclusion. Now, let me go to the issue of protectionism that you raised. I've already pointed to why, with some people feeling left behind by globalization, of course, you look inward and you blame, there's a tendency to think it's being done to you by trade. But if you look carefully, I just want to say this one thing, that many studies that have been done shows that trade really changes the composition of employment. It doesn't so much take away jobs or add as many, it changes the composition of employment. And I think that what governments have not done, and they have to think of doing, is when this happens and you see sectors changing, a combination of trade and technology, you need active labor market policies in order to handle this. And that is job training, new skills for those who are left behind, trying to move them to areas where the jobs are, because economic theory doesn't always work. For cultural reasons, people stay in West Virginia. They don't want to move to the Sun Belt in the US. So we have to have active labor market policies and social safety nets to take care of those. And we haven't done that. So those people feel left behind. And that is why they turn to populism and nationalism. And then governments feel compelled, politicians, I would say, respond to these. So that tendency, coupled with what we've seen in the pandemic, of course, the fact that countries woke up and discovered that perhaps a large percentage of the inputs for manufacturing certain medicines and medical supplies and vaccines come from just a handful of countries. The fact that 80% of vaccine exports is concentrated in 10 countries. And when people are sick, even if sometimes when the people want to export, politicians, it's very hard for them to tell people they are being altruistic and they will export. So everyone has realized that when it comes to something like this, it's sometimes each country for themselves, which is in a way short-sighted. As a result, there's this rush to nearshore and, to diversify nearshore and reshore from just in time to just in case, in order to manage risks. And I think there'll be some of that. But to move from that to policies, industrial policies that lead to protectionism, I think is something we need to watch. It's interesting to me that industrial policy is back in a way. I hope it's not the kind of industrial policy where you're picking winners and losers, because that's the kind that is anti-competitive and doesn't work when you're doing that. You certainly can have some types of industrial policies when you improve infrastructure, you put the internet in place, you improve information for businesses so they know where markets are, you change information asymmetry. When you're able to do all these things for business, that's also a help. That's the type of industrial policy that is good. But picking winners and losers, subsidizing in an anti-competitive way, a distortionary way, I think those are the things that would be against WTO rules and which we would say we try to stay away from.
Thank you so much for that. And obviously within the context of a very rich economic debate in the United States right now. I'm going to turn now to former colleague of mine, so colleague now at the Atlantic Council, Clete Willems.
Thank you, Dr. Ngozi. It's great to have you here, and I really appreciate your leadership and the energy that you've provided to a lot of the ongoing WTO negotiations. But I must confess that when a lot of policymakers in the United States think about the long-term problems at the WTO, they really think about things that we haven't yet discussed at all today, and that's the issue of developing country status. That's the issue of China's industrial policies and the issue of overreach by the dispute settlement system. And I think people are also troubled that those problems all seem to be somewhat predicated on philosophical differences between the members. When you look at developing country status, there seems to be a difference of opinion as to whether trade liberalization is actually good for development. There seems to be a difference of opinion as to whether the WTO should be trying to promote market-oriented policies. And there's a difference of opinion of the role of the adjudicators in the dispute settlement system more broadly as compared to the members in setting the rules. And so my question for you is, in light of these strong philosophical divides, is there any hope in solving these problems? And what is the role that you see yourself playing in helping bridge some of those very serious differences?
Well, thanks very much, Clayton. I want to differ with you slightly. A lot of the things you said are correct, but I do not believe that what is happening is this. People believe that trade, even those countries that are not perfectly market economies, they believe that trade and trade liberalization is the right way to go. The issue is, how do they put this into practice? And that's where the debate comes. You mentioned industrial policies. If governments move to industrial policies or subsidization, both on the industry side, but also in agriculture, and these policies are distortionary, and you see on both sides of the ideological divide that there are countries who are doing this. They are subsidizing agriculture to a large extent. These are market economies, and some not perfectly market economies are subsidizing maybe industry. So so it's a question of the approach, but I do believe that all came together because trade liberalization is seen as a market-driven economy, is seen as a way of growing globally, growing the economy. So that's the only slight difference. It's not so, it's the way it's been applied. Now, having said that, I also want to note that it's very puzzling to me that when the WTO and GATT, when GATT was created and the WTO, the rules that were put in place were very different. It was at the same time that the IMF and the World Bank were created. And there it's very clear what is a least developed country, what is a developing country, what is a developed country? Because there are clear rules of the game with respect to per capita income. But it's the same countries that created the WTO. At the WTO, there was no such delineation. It was said that countries could self-describe themselves as developing and undeveloped as they wish. So this is very bad. So you had countries with fairly high income, saying they are developing, others, emerging markets, so on, least developed countries. So I just want to let you know that this was a design problem in the way I see it. Now, the issue is, how do we take care of all this? Is the best answer to walk away and say this doesn't work? It's this organization, the WTO, has worked for the US, has worked for China, has worked for the UK, the EU, and lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty and enriched economies. It's still the same organization. So the issue is not how do we walk away and say this doesn't work, it's dysfunctional. The issue is how do we reform what we have in order to make it work better? Because I think if the WTO did not exist, you have to create it. There is no other forum in the world where you have rules and you can hold members accountable if they don't go according to those rules. If we don't have it, we'll be left with 15th and 16th and 17th century trade wars and so on and so forth. So that is what I'm saying. So the fundamental issue is, how do you reform this? I believe that WTO rules really do need to be updated to take account of recent developments. Economies have evolved in different ways. We have many distortionary policies on all sides. I just mentioned what we call domestic support, agricultural policies, but industrial policies and subsidization of SOEs and so on. We have to tackle all of this so we can have a level playing field. What we have done, or we are trying to do in the WTO, we join hands with the IMF, the OECD, and the World Bank, and we've launched a study on these issues, on the issues of distortionary subsidies, so we can really get the facts on the table. So that's going on. A study and you can see if all four institutions join together in this way, that's powerful. That means we see a problem, and until we get the facts on the ground about the extent and nature, we cannot solve this problem. So that's what the institutions are trying to do. In companionship with that, we've also at the WTO started to say we need to get facts on the ground. We look even deeper at issues of agricultural policies and subsidies, as well as industrial policies and subsidies, to buttress the bigger study that we're doing. So I think once we have all those, we can now talk to our members and say, look, instead of just talking about it and feeling bad about it, here are some facts. How do we use this as a basis for changing our rules or updating them? We already have an agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures. We can update this. We can make it more modern once we know which way to go, once we have the facts. So I would not give up and say, I think we have the opportunity to reform the place, and we should do that.
Question I'm going to pass to Barbara Matthews, another fellow in our center.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Ngozi, thank you very much for this thought-provoking discussion today, as well as for your leadership. I want to pick up on the theme that you just closed with on updating the rules, updating the WTO, really for the next century. You have very rightly noted that the future is digital. And of course, the core of the Bretton Woods institutions is one of economic interdependence, and nothing accelerates economic interdependence like the digital economy. You have, it strikes me, a wonderful opportunity to move forward and bring the WTO into the 21st century. And you have two choices, and I'd love to understand your priorities. You can move pragmatically, issue by issue, moving forward the plurilateral work on cross-border data flows, continuing work on digital customs facilitation, working on the digital trade and goods and services, the trade and services agreement, and you can make incremental progress in each one of these issues. You can also alternatively focus on some broad horizontal shifts that recognize the centrality of the digital economy to interdependence and economic growth. These obviously are not mutually exclusive, but they do require focus, and they require a significant amount of engagement in areas where there is frankly not a lot of agreement internationally. I'm hoping you could provide some perspective on where your priorities are on the various initiatives that have been really lingering now for quite some time, and where you'd like to see progress in 2022 and 2023.
Well, thank you, Barbara. Let me just start by saying I gave the vision, so I don't have to repeat it. I want to see a WTO that focuses on people, because I simply believe that as an organizing principle, if that's the purpose you have, your vision and strategy will build around that. That being said, so why do I say that? Because everything that we can modernize to improve the living standards of people, to support sustainability, those are the things that interest me. So The priorities, as I see, they are short-term and they are longer-term. First, to the point that was made earlier, I think by Fred, about trust. I think we need to begin by trying to work on things that can give us some success, some victories, because I believe from there we can march on to much more difficult things that we've laid out, where we need to do reforms and where there's some contention. So that is why for the short term, I'm trying to focus on getting the fisheries subsidies negotiations done, because it's SDG 14.6. We are contributing to sustainability. The world has asked us to do this. And if we can do that, that's a win. If we move from that to something that really occupies me, which is trade and health, this is with us now, and we are going to have future pandemics. So we are working to see how can we get a framework agreement on the contribution of trade and the WTO to solving health issues like the pandemic in such a way that when the next pandemic comes, it triggers some actions automatically. We don't have to come and discuss and debate it again and agree. For example, what happens to export restrictions and prohibitions if a pandemic is triggered? What do we do about it? Just to give one, what happens to technology transfer, IP, for medicines and so on? So some of these things, I think, are modern things. There are things of the future also that we have to, and I'm very, very seized with these issues because I believe we need to solve them now. That's a topmost priority. Why? Because lives are at stake. Lives are at stake. We move from that to other issues that are fundamental. One is the digital that we've spoken so much about, because I believe that's here with us to say. I'm actually quite excited about it because I think it can help with inclusion. So I'm very much in a hurry to see how we can get the agreements, rules. We don't have them yet, so we have to create them. And hopefully we'll create them in a way that will be sustained and can encourage digital trade. Then there are issues of trade and environment. You know, that we haven't spoken about, but climate change is with us and it's here to stay. So the question is, how can trade contribute to net zero by 2050? That's a question that is eminently answerable. That makes us focus on these sectoral issues, modern issues, and I think we can contribute. Members here have launched structured discussions on these issues. They're talking about climate. They're talking about plastics pollution. They're talking about various aspects of climate, issues of carbon taxes, which are very delicate because many members have issues with carbon taxes so that they are not seen as protectionist measures. But these are modern issues, cross-sectoral, that we can deal with. How do we provide incentives to environmentally friendly goods? How does trade contribute to that? So you can see there are many issues, and my favorite, inclusion. How do we make people see that trade matters? How is it that if I go to my village and I talk about WTO, the person in the village will know that I'm talking about an organization and an activity which they do. They trade with each other. How does WTO come in? These are some of the visions I have. Let us be known to people that we're beneficial to them. Let's move with the times and help to solve global problems of health, environment, digital. So I believe we can do it. We can't do them all at once, but we can sequence what we want to do and our actions and tackle these things, some in parallel, some one after the other.
Again, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and explaining to us again why trade matters. And we hope to continue this conversation. Kick over to my teammate, Director of the Geoeconomic Center, Josh Lipsky, to close the.
Well, thank you, Julia, and thank you, Dr. Ngozi, for coming to share your thoughts and vision with us. after this weekend's extraordinarily important G20 finance ministers meeting in Venice. As you said, trade matters. And with this event today, the Geoeconomic Center now over the past 12 months has hosted the heads of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and now the World Trade Organization. And each leader has said it's a moment to reform and revitalize the international financial and trading system. And I think that's striking. And I do think it's an opportunity. And you said, Dr. Ngozi, there's momentum for reform across advanced economies, emerging markets, developing economies. There are differences of opinion of what that reform means, but there's agreement that reform needs to happen. And that is a once in a generation moment. And so, Dr. Ngozi, we pledge to be your partner in that effort. We're confident that you and the WTO team will be able to tackle that difficult work. And we'll continue to foster debate, present creative solutions, and bring people together like we've done today. In fact, tomorrow we'll host an event on digital services tax, which will continue some of the important negotiations that happened over the past weekend. The link to register is in everyone's chat. And we want to thank you again, Dr. Ngozi. It's been an honor. We want to thank everyone at the WTO and Atlantic Council for collaborating with us. And we want to thank everyone for joining this Atlantic Council front page.